All right. Welcome to this next series of the Career Center Lab, where I'll be talking about time management for interviewing. Where's my camera at? There it goes. There we go. Well, thank you all for making it tonight's conversation that we're going to have. I'll be focusing on talking about technical interviewing and time management. We'll have a few people come through in a little bit, and I know that this recording itself will be available for those that missed it. So whoever's here, Zen, I see you. Thank you for pulling up and getting here by 4 o'clock and definitely being a part of the audience to catch this live. So let me go ahead and start the presentation and then we'll walk through it. And if you have any questions, definitely feel free to throw them in the chat room. People may be showing up. So if they do show up, show them a little hospitality, maybe show them, mention something in the chat room if there is something to mention. If not, I will continue to run down my slide deck here. All right. So today's conversation is about technical interviewing and time management, really specifically around what are some of the things that I do in two different scenarios to start to get prepared for interviewing, either before, or what a cool area that I think we'll cover is actually during the interview, how time management is extremely valuable. So first of all, just to introduce myself, if you haven't had a chance to meet me yet, and if you haven't had a chance to get on my calendar to do mock interviews, talk about tech, talk about a journey in engineering, talk from my perspective, please reach out so that you can take advantage of this offering here at CodePath. My name is Bobby Dorlis, and I'm someone that's been in the field for a number of years, a total of 20, but my real value contributions as of late has worked at a very cool social media company called Twitter, where I became a staff SRE engineer. As an SRE, my skill sets range from systems engineering, I know how that works, and software engineering, which I know how that works. You put those together, you get somebody like me that basically managing the site's reliability. I left there a few months ago before all the layoffs, and big shout outs to all the tweets that unfortunately experienced this last week. It's definitely been a tough one. If you're looking to follow along in terms of journey that I'm on, hashtag Team Dorless, the Tech Hustle is the brand that I work for or that I own, and Black Tech Twitter is where it's at. First generation Haitian American, so I know what it means to be an immigrant and always looking for those type of conversations. But another cool thing about me is my programming languages that I like to write. Python is my most proficient language, but I also write code in Go, Golang, and Bash. I mean, Bash, I go far back with Bash, and Bash is more or less just like the terminal when you log into a Linux machine. And a lot of people don't know that that's actually a programming language in itself, and I have a proficiency level at that. If you want more information about my journey, about skill sets that I've developed, systems engineering, software engineering, get on my calendar. I have times available before the end of the year, and definitely looking forward to inspire you, motivate you, and get you ready for this field, this field of engineering and technology. But tonight's conversation is going to be focused on two time management practices that help you land a tech interview. Now, before we continue, I want to make sure that we understand the definition of time management. And the importance of ensuring that you're putting the right time into place so that you can get the expected results, which is getting hired or getting a job, right? And also talking about the lack of putting time management into practice also has a negative effects in those results. We'll cover that even more. But more specifically, I want to just talk to you about two different practices that I do before I go into an interview. And obviously, it's a few days, potentially week before the interview that I put some time into it, but then also the value of time management during the interview. Because if you didn't know, interviews don't go on forever. I don't know if you ever wanted to sit in a room, for 4 hours talking about tech. I mean, I can enjoy that time in that space, but interviewing itself is very burdensome, and preparing for them can really take a toll on you. So with these skills, you'll be able to shorten those times that you're spending preparing, but also focusing on things that you need to prepare, but also during the interview, how do you manage the time the best way possible? So we're going to jump in our first time management section that we're going to talk about, which is more or less a practice, is preparing for your interview. Now, the thing that I want you all to make sure you're aware of is that if you are preparing on the day of the interview, that's not preparing for an interview. A story that I'll tell you real quick. I remember one time I got a call from a recruiter talking about a position at some company, I can't remember which. And they actually called me that same day, not just to talk to me, but also interview me on that phone. That was by far one of the worst interviews I've ever had. And there was an opportunity for me to tell the recruiter, or actually it was an engineer on the other line, that, hey, today's not a good day for me to, do this interview because, number one, I didn't prepare, and it's kind of like a day of interview. I'm confident in my skill set, but even me with all these years of experience, you need to prepare. And the results of that interview were negative. I mean, I didn't get the job, but it also enlightened me on the fact that if I do not prepare for an interview, don't expect to land an interview. So if you are doing day of preparing, just know that you are not setting yourself up to be successful in the process, but more or less you have to put in those efforts and time to get yourself ramped up to execute very well. Now, thinking about just how difficult it is for day of interviewing, imagine them asking you a question about technology that you haven't had a chance to work on for a while, or describing some type of coding language that really reflects, you know what? I am so sorry. I forgot to press the recording button did press. I guess forget it. We'll just keep going. They're going to see the recording afterwards. I apologize. I stopped because I thought I didn't press the record button, but it looks like I did. So we'll get back into it. But we're talking about day of is not preparing. I'm sorry, I'm getting recalibrated. So the skill sets that you need to have available for you to be able to pull something day of sometimes require you to prepare for it. If they're referencing your resume that had a skill set that you worked on years ago, you need to prepare to think about and get your mind in the right mindset for you to be able to speak on those topics. But more or less, the other thing is that keeping your knife sharp, which I have here on the slide, is really important for you to be able to be successful at interviewing. Now, day of, we've already took that off the table of, hey, we don't want to do day of preparation, but keeping those knife sharps for that day of interviewing is something that you definitely want to make sure you are maintaining and continually iterating while you're sitting there waiting to be interviewed, and or, hey, I know I have an interview in 2 weeks. Let me start to sharpen the knives. Sharpen the knives for me means reviewing code that I've worked on before, reviewing the different coding language I say that I'm proficient at. At the beginning of the slide, I said something about Python, Golang, and Bash. I need to make sure I've been reading and doing those programming languages as of lately frequently enough for me to perform in an interview. So you're going to have to keep those knife sharps. And not just coding, but imagine someone with a background like mine in systems engineering. I have to refresh my memory on how did I set up that system that I'm going to talk about in the next interview, or what problems did I run into so I can remember those experiences to bring them up, or maybe even some limitations in certain software. It's like I've had questions before where they ask me, why would you choose this software versus the other one? Guess what? I need to keep those knife sharps to understand the differences between those softwares so then I can give a valid and relatable response to that type of question. But my key thing here that I want to emphasize about keeping your knife sharp, and this is more or less for students that are either in school, cohorts that are actually full-time employees, you're transitioning out into another career, is that you're going to have time away from the keyboard. You're going to have time away from iterating and learning this skill set. You're going to have to find ways to introduce practices so that you can sharpen those skills. And this is time management. What do I mean by that? What I mean is if I have an interview lined up, or if I know I'm going to be in the interview loop, I need to make sure that I'm scheduling time on my calendar and whatever I'm doing to dedicate the time for me to proficient or bring that skill set back up to a proficient level. And when I'm talking about time management, I'm not just talking about a stopwatch, a few seconds and waiting for it to stop. I mean, preparing and scheduling time on your calendar. I mentioned something about a calendar briefly, but that's how I really am able to say, I can look at my calendar 2 weeks back from my interview and say, this day, this day, this day, and this day, I'm going to dedicate time for me to resharpen my knives. It's extremely important that you spend time doing that, because like I mentioned to you before, if you don't, in day of type of interviewing, don't expect the results to be a positive. It might actually be a negative. And technically, it will be feedback for you the next cycle around for you to be mindful of, hey, I need to spend more time preparing for these type of interviews, especially sharpen my skills. Now, the last thing that I mentioned there is calibrating your mindset. Now, I briefly talked about spending time reviewing code and kind of like getting yourself familiar with different coding languages that you're proficient at, but also different technologies that are different. But calibrating your mindset is something that's extremely important, because I briefly talked about, hey, a scenario when I worked in an environment, I did X, Y, Z, and this was the result. If you don't spend time refreshing that memory and bringing them back to the front of your mind, then you won't be able to perform and or bring those type of skill sets to the front when you're explaining some of the things that you've worked on in the past. So what do I spend that time in terms of time management, calibrating my mindset? Is spending time reading my resume again. Like, make sure you read it from top to bottom. You know how many candidates this is a little sidebar, that I've interviewed and I asked them specific things on their resume and they were like, I don't remember I did that. And I'm like, yo, but you put this on your resume. I was like, oh, I forgot that I put that there. Spend some time reviewing your resume. Spend some time reviewing your code to get your mindset back into that rhythm, that frequency. I mean, most of you all are focusing on lead code, HackerRank, algorithm problems, data structures, string manipulations. Like, that's what you're mostly focusing on right now. Now, let's take a week off of that and then not do that. Guess what? Your mindset needs to be recalibrated back into that lead code, HackerRank mindset. You have to spend time doing that. Overall, understanding the value of that opportunity to calibrate is your ability to roll the time back and really dedicate the resources that you need. If the one thing that I would take away from this slide here in terms of preparing for interviews is that if you don't put in the work, unfortunately, you won't get the expected results. And you have to spend time continuing to sharpen, develop these skill sets, recalibrating your mindset, and definitely using the resources that you may have not used in a while and bring them back to the forefront so that you can be proficient at interviewing. Now, I'm not sure if everybody's on the same page in terms of how valuable this is, but if I do have one thing to say is, if you don't do and spend this time and take advantage of this time management skill, you may not get the results as you expect. All right. So the next slide that we're going to go through is time management during the interview. One thing that is really cool about interviewing is that there is a time limit. I say this jokingly because if you can think of a time where you had to just sit there and truly just spend time with somebody talking about tech for hours, sometimes not having a time limit can stretch the conversation out for hours long. But in interviews, you have time limits. You have a certain amount of time to show your proficiency at the skill that you're interviewing for. And the key thing here about during the interview that I want you to take home with you about time is limited is that know that there is not an endless amount of time. There's a limited amount of time you're going to have to showcase the skill set, and ultimately showcasing the skill set, if you don't get to that point, may result in you not getting the job. Now, what do I mean by this time is limited? Let's say that you're interviewing for a software engineering position and you actually have to do some coding, right? If you think about the idea of coding itself, it takes some time for you to kind of put your thoughts together, get it to a point where you can actually write code and then just actually generate some code that's at the level that they want it to be, right? They're saying, hey, no brute force, we want the most optimal amount of code. Just know that the problem you're solving usually should not exceed that 45-minute to an hour time frame. So when you're practicing and getting ready for an interview and you're doing lead code, just make sure that you bring that time frame down as much as you can to maybe a 30 to 45 minutes for you to be able to solve these problems, because you are limited in time. If you're not practicing those limits or those barriers for problems that you have to solve, unfortunately, when you get into an interview, you're going to run out of time. I know I mentioned something about it's okay to run out of time, but that's a different use case. I'm talking about you're midway solving a solution and you don't have enough time to come up with a solution to solve the problem. And that's where I want you to make sure that you're using your time management skills, especially practicing and especially during the interview, keeping mindfulness of, hey, I only got 45 minutes to 30 minutes to really write some code. I need to make sure that I'm making progress and iterating through the problem that we're trying to solve. I know that we're talking about code, and usually CodePath students are focused on software engineering, but just know that jumping into code, I said, don't just jump into code. Jumping into code may be the worst thing you do if you're thinking about shortening that time. An example, we talked about solving a coding problem and kind of my process of, hey, evaluating, maybe I didn't even describe it. What my process is evaluating the problem, making sure that we're collecting as much requirements, coming back and saying, hey, this is my solution of what I'm going to produce, and then started submitting code. Now, when I was originally talking about writing code during an interview, I say it's about 60 minutes to 45 minutes. And I said that there's about 30-minute time for you to actually write code. So that means there's about 15 minutes for you to kind of put your thoughts together, collaborate with the interviewer, make sure you're both on the right frequency in terms of how you're going to solve this problem, and then start jumping into code. The worst thing you can do is to jump into code and then start solving the problem while you're coding. You're going to spend way too much time. You may even go solve the wrong problem because you're solving some coding issue rather than really understanding the foundational problem you need to solve. So the real key here about, hey, don't just jump into coding is you may actually spend more time writing code if you don't understand the problem, get clarity before, versus just jumping into code and just not make it at the end. Now, I'm gonna give you an example, a real world example, where I had a student that came in, or a candidate that came into an interview, and they were really excited about getting to the whiteboard and actually starting to write code. And one thing that they mentioned to me at the beginning of the interview is that they usually like to jump into writing code. And I more or less was waiting for them to do that, but them saying that out loud actually made them rethink about the idea of jumping into code, because we spent the exact time that we need, about 10 to 15 minutes, to actually come up with a solution, and then going to the whiteboard and outputting some code that after the interview, it was something that I documented in terms of the candidate was mindful of the challenges they have with brute forcing and just jumping into code. And the feedback that I was writing was really highlighting that they were self-aware that they may actually have those tendencies, but understood the value of taking the time to understand the problem itself. And the results of this story is that that person actually got hired. They got hired at Twitter, and they were a high-performing engineer by the time I left. But in general, that was one of those examples of somebody saying, hey, I usually do this habit. And I was like, oh, if you do that, I don't know if you're going to get this problem in my mind. And they actually did the opposite effect. So make sure you understand the value that you're taking, or the value that I'm speaking of when I say don't just jump into writing code. This is all part of time management. I know you got 60 minutes, but you don't want to spend all your 60 minutes writing code over and over. You want to spend a certain amount of time thinking about the problem, coming up with the solution, and then executing on code. Now, the last one that I mentioned here, and I kind of, mentioned it, but it's contradictory, that it's okay to run out of time. And let me give you the real reason why I'm bringing this up. Is that one thing that most people feel at the end of the interview is if you get into a point where you're talking, and all of a sudden the interviewer says, hey, we're going to have to cut this short because we're running out of time. Oh, anxiety may hit you. It may be like, oh, I went over time and I wasn't. But the key thing is that if you're in a real deep conversation and we're really talking about tech, you don't know that you may have already showcased the skill set that I needed for us to be able to provide feedback to support you being hired, that our conversation is just running on because we just really love to talk about tech. And the real foundational thing that I'm getting here is that if you do run out of time, especially if it's one of those conversations where you're really just trying to emphasize a topic or really just trying to, provide some insights into where you're at in your skill, don't feel bad if you do run out of time. Now, the times that you feel bad about running out of time is if you're in the middle of solving a problem and you did not, or were unable to showcase or articulate the results or the remaining amount of code that you need to run or you were going to write. But it is okay to run out of time. But the key thing is that if it is that point where you're midway through something, the results may not be great. But if you're at the end and we're talking and we're really, relaxed and we're just having a conversation, chatting about tech, chatting about their job, my job, and what I would potentially be doing at the company, and you run out of time, that's okay. That doesn't mean that you're not out of the run. That just means that you were having a really great conversation and you could go on for another hour or two. Whenever I've had those opportunities to run out of time in an interview, I usually got the interview because we were having some really good, deep conversation. We just lost track of time rather than running out of time. But overall, I just want to emphasize two things here about during the interview in terms of time management is just remember that you have a limited amount of time that you have to solve a problem, and don't jump into writing code because you're going to spend too much time. trying to fix your problems before you actually understand the solution. All right. Now, this is the part of our conversation where I definitely want to open it up for questions. I know we have one person at least online. If you feel up to it, go ahead and open your mic and let me know if you have any questions you would like to ask.
Hey, Bobby, thank you for the presentation. Appreciate it. It's really good, informative. I just have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. So my first question is, sometimes during the interview, the interviewer allow the candidate to Google it, right? In that case, as a candidate, what can you exactly Google? Sometimes you enter something and it could be a Stack Overflow with the answer, right? You don't want to think that you're cheating. At the same time, you like it. There's the first thing come up, like you don't want to keep scrolling down either. So what exactly can the candidate Google in that case?
That's a really good question. And if you think about how the interviewer is actually giving you an opportunity to use the resources that you would use on your daily basis, you shouldn't feel bad about finding the answers on the same resources that we use on a daily basis. Because the thing about engineering, it's not how much you can remember. It's actually how much you can remember where to find the answer, right? And if you can find the answer like that because it was on Stack Overflow, guess what? You found the answer like that. Now, the key thing about finding answers on any of these platforms that offer kind of like a centralized location on, problems that you could solve is, number one, don't just trust the answer that they gave you, right? Is also validating it, right? So I've been in an interview where they've given me access to Google and I'm like, all right, let me see where I can remember. I can't remember this argument. Let me go look at Google. Stack Overflow pops up and it says, hey, make sure you use -s. I'm not just going to go and use -s. I'm actually going to do even more research. That command with -s and look for other resources just to reconfirm what I found, just to show them that my research doesn't just stop at the first place that I found the answer. My research is, all right, I found somewhere, but now I need a reaffirming find somewhere else for me to say, oh yeah, actually that is what I need. Or you start to reference resource docs, right? Let's say that I'm talking about a command, just go to the website that actually built the command or the repository that built the command and look up their documentation, right? These are the type of ways that engineers on a daily basis are finding their resolutions to the problems. Don't feel bad. And I know you said something earlier, it feels like I'm cheating. It's not cheating. Like, this is how we do it. This is how we get around and solve these problems at a very fast pace, is using the collective mind of the internet. Somebody that solved that same problem before, it shortens my time in being able to resolve that issue. So don't feel bad about it. I would just say, hey, you're going to add another step so it doesn't look like you're just copy and paste and just run with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I had it experience one time and I don't know the answer to it. I can't remember top of my head the question, but like, you kind of Google it, but then sometimes you like, how deep can you Google it? You don't want to seem like you Googling, what is this? Like it, as in like you kind of looking and like sometimes you kind of in that moment you kind of like it froze a little, it freeze a little bit, right? Like, do I know it or like do I not know enough? Like, so I just want to double check like what exactly can you Google? Like if you see like a, it's different from seeing W3 School versus Stack Overflow, right? Like
Yeah.
like you don't want to seem like you're cheating too, right? That's it, that boundary, like who's okay with it, who's not okay with it, what is that,
Yeah, I
that
mean,
green light for that? Yeah.
don't feel like it's cheating, and that's kind of like where I want you to be mindful of our skill as engineers is we're basically researchers, right? We're researching the solution as quickly as possible. And if you have to look up, hey, what is this extra argument or a syntax thing, some people may be like, oh, they validating that they're writing the right syntax rather than, oh, they don't know what they're doing, they have to go look up syntax. For me, I'm saying, oh, I didn't remember it off the top of my head. I can't remember all this stuff. Like technology and engineering stretches so far in terms of the spectrum. Talk about front end, we talk about back end, we talk about databases, we talk about cybersecurity, we're talking about systems engineering. Like there is so much for you to maintain in your brain, right? The internet is our resource to be able to say, all right, I don't have to remember this. If I ever have to look it up, I'll just look it up in some documentation or look at Google or Stack Overflow. So don't feel no type of way. And if they are offering it as a resource, I would use it to this full potential, because I would hate you to be in a situation where you could have looked up something to get the job, but you were hesitant to look up it because you didn't know what they were going to think of you. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. So let's say in an interview, they don't say anything. Like, can you ask to be look up something in Google or no? Because I had it like, yeah. So I wasn't sure like if they don't say anything, like can you still ask them like, can I Google something or is that like a frown upon like that asking that question?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the organization. Some places will blatantly say, hey, use all the resources you have available, just like you're an engineer at the company, right? And that's the mindset that I like to interview and have people feel comfortable enough to do. Some places will not mention anything. And then as soon as you say, hey, you're going to go Google, and then they go and mark you X, right? Some places may be that, right? The best way that I like to kind of let them know where I'm at in my thought process is number one, calling out like, hey, I don't remember this off the top of my head. Normally I would Google this or look on Stack Overflow for something similar. My search query would be, hey, I would take this error message and I would add, this type of wording to look and get a more narrowed down result. Do you mind if I use Google to, find this answer, or would you like me to continue to iterate and ponder about a type of solution? That right there, in terms of response, is giving the interviewer two things. Number one, where you would go to look for the answer, or look for a solution to give you an answer, and how you would do it. And then number two, I'm still okay if you don't want me to do that, but just know that I am going to be pondering about the answer and just drifting off and trying to throw something on the wall to see if that might be the answer. That's how I've used it in the past. And either one or two things happen. It's like, hey, let's just make it a conversation. We just go down this rabbit hole. Or no, go ahead and use Google just like you were at work, and we're just over your shoulder, just watching it, and then ultimately looking for a solution. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Do you mind if I ask you two more questions? I know we are already up at time,
No
so
worries. No worries. Go ahead.
I know you mentioned your SIE. Is the interview process the same for like an SIE role versus like coming in a software engineer? Is the interview process the same thing or it's different? Like I feel
It
like
could
they do two different things, right? In some level, like you don't like create a new feature if you're SIE, right? But then is the interview process the same thing or is it like a different process?
Yeah, it could be, it varies based on the company. And the reason why I say that is the practice of SRE is still kind of in its first few years. Some companies do SRE one way, some companies do SRE and DevOps a totally different way. The key thing is make sure that you look at the job description. You'll see SRE software engineering positions. Guess what? They're interviewing you as a software engineer with SRE principles and practices. You may see a job posting that says SRE systems engineering practices, or SRE, and then you look in the job description and all it's mentioning is systems engineering things. Expect those type of questions to be asked, right? So SREs do fall into that bucket where you can be a software engineer, you can be a systems engineer, and someone like me where you mingle with both of them, you're more or less like a dual a dual citizen, more or less. And they may ask you questions from either side of the table. The key thing is to make sure that you look at the job description, make sure you're doing research, spending that time. When I was talking about prepping, this is part of the prep time. Prep time, like researching the company, looking at their blog posts, looking at their job descriptions, looking at other job descriptions that don't even fall under the same one you are, so that you can kind of get an understanding of the type of systems that they work on. But there is no specific interview for SREs that is, hey, it's only software engineering or it's only systems engineering. It really depends on the job position that's listed. So I would more or less focus on that and then start sharpening those skills based on those type of job descriptions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Really helpful too. Thank you, Bobby. Appreciate that. The other question is like, what programming language like do you see like most SRE like should like doesn't matter what company you go to, you should know it, aside from like Linux, right? I don't know, like it's most people use some company doesn't really. I mean, they use it, but depending on like how they define like SRE rule, right? I've seen it where like it just not read fully SRE, right? Like it just like what programming language like do you think like a SRE like it, or if you were to apply for it, like
Totally.
hands down, you should know this.
Yeah. So, in general, one of the programming languages that have been extremely universal over the years is Python. Python is one of the easier languages to learn. It's very phonic in the way that it's written, in terms of just, hey, you're writing it just like regular English. Even variables, they want you to use these, variable names that relate to what you're doing. But also, there's no real major syntax requirements like double quotes, close brackets, and stuff like that. It's just indentation. And Python has definitely been a language that I see all over the boards when you're talking about SRE and DevOps, and those skill sets. Another programming language that's really getting some popularity and kind of I build up some proficiency on is Golang, or Go. It's a programming language that's created by Google, and it's really like one of those competing languages for like C, C++, like one of those compiled low latency type languages. It's not as hard or rigorous as R or Rust or something like that, but it's definitely one of those programming languages that I see more people mentioning and using, especially if you're doing things with infrastructure, Kubernetes, and things like that. Anytime you see a file that says whatever the file name .go, it's more or less written in the Go language. Now, the other thing about SREing is that programming languages in those lanes are not the only languages that you learned over the years. So I also had to learn a programming language called Puppet or Terraform or infrastructure as code, if you've ever heard of that. It's more or less designing software in a way that automatically executes certain things on a massive amount of computers and maintain those configurations consistently. It requires you to write code to do it, which they're usually based off of like Ruby or even Python, but they do have their own syntax. They have their own way of, executing the code and or writing code. And that's an area that I would say, if you're looking for SREs, is definitely familiarize yourself with a coding language that is tailored for infrastructure as code. And that's Puppet, Terraform, Salt, Ansible is the one from Red Hat. Any of those configuration management languages would be great to also learn. So those would be the ones that I would mostly focus on. And then anything about APIs and understanding how APIs work, please grasp a good understanding from the get, so then you can take those into any programming languages that you prefer. But that's definitely the lanes that I would suggest.
Thank you, Bobby. I said that was the last question, but I do have one more question. So
Go,
sometimes when you have nothing, you have no interview, right? Sometimes all of a sudden you get these you don't get the job, but then you kind of get these initial call or 2 or 3 round, right? You go to, and sometimes it's overwhelming because one company using one language, the other company using another language, but even though they know that you don't know it, but you kind of have to know a little bit, right? So that you can have the initial pass, stage from the, I guess the recruiter round at least, right? Just so that you kind of understand what to say to them. So, but let's say you are in 2 or 3, already into 2 or 3 interview stage, and then you kind of a little bit tired because you have too many interview happening within a week. How far can you push back to go to the next stage?
Yeah.
Sometimes you kind of want to, oh my God, I kind of want to at least a month because I'm kind of back to back with different and I sometimes you kind of want to know if you already got the job from something that you already interviewed 4 rounds, but then you kind of waiting for them to hear from them, right? You don't hear from them, and then at the end you don't get it, but at the same time you kind of want that oh, I'm tired, I kind of want to see what they say in it. At the end they say yes, get green light, I'll take it, and instead of going to all these different rounds again, right? So how far can you push back those not the initial one, you're already in that stage. Yeah.
I would definitely say make sure you bring this up initially with the recruiter, because I'll tell you a recruiter's job to get people hired, right? And they're trying to get people into the door, into the process, and getting them going through interviews so that they can get the results as soon as possible. That's a recruiter's job. So if they can line you up 3 interviews back to back, that's what their goal is. Be very, very adamant about your preparation for interviewing, right? And recruiters are going to call you and say, hey, we want to interview tomorrow. No, I need to prepare. I need to get my mind in the right frequency. We talked about time management and how you need time to prepare for an interview, and day of preparing is you're not going to get the right results. And if you just convey it in the sense of, hey, I am going to perform better, and my likelihood of getting hired is for me to take this time to prepare, the recruiter is going to listen to you, because it is hard finding candidates. It's hard to interview. It's hard to get people into the pipeline. And if you have something that they're looking for, I guarantee you they're willing to pause the brakes a little bit, making sure that your attempt when you said you're going to go bat is that you're going to hit the ball out the park. So I would call it out immediately when you first having conversation, especially if they're having calendar invites pop up and be like, oh, no, I can't do this interview back to back to back to back, right? It's I need at least a few days, or what you're saying is a week to prepare, because it's almost like a second job getting ready for interviews. And it's a second job for the interviewers at the company to do interviews, right? So anything that you can do to make your preparation more align with you successfully getting the job, I would voice that immediately and don't feel like, hey, they're going to push back. If they push back, and then maybe that's not the right company for you, right? Seriously, it's just something that it could really be a burdensome with back-to-back interviews and preparation. So definitely space them out. And don't be afraid to mention that to the recruiter. And when it comes to like the next rounds, after the next rounds, let them know, hey, I need a few days to prepare for the next round because this round just kicked my butt type stuff, right? So it's okay to voice those opinions, and definitely feel free to talk to the recruiter, and don't let them, run you over, because at the end of the day, they want you to succeed because they want you to get hired. And you want to put the effort in the right amount for you to, make a successful attempt. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much, Bobby. That's all the question I have. Thank you for your time.
Awesome.
I really appreciate it. And this is really like a good, like a really like a informative session. I really appreciate that.
Of course, of course. Well, thank you so much for the shout outs and asking the questions. We're going to jump back into the slide so I can close this back out. But if you do have any other questions, I do have availability in my calendar, and they're 45-minute session for us to talk about tech, do mock interviews, and so on and so forth. Or I just have a 30-minute session where we can just come and chop it up, and I can give you some more perspective and answer some questions that are very much similar, like I just answered Zen's questions. All right. So the last slide that I have is a big shout outs to the Career Center. We are here to support you. We are here shooting for you to do the best that you can. Either myself or Catalina are the career coach. I'm mostly focusing on tech. She basically focuses on behavioral, talking about tech, her experience, getting you in the right mindset, reviewing your resume or your LinkedIn. And she's one of the best out in the industry overall. We have Kelsey, Anthony, and Geneva that are running, the program management and the Career Center overall. They're all resources that are available to you if you need. So please feel free to reach out. And again, thank you so much for tuning in today's session. So we are at the end of our session here. And Zen, definitely hit me up offline, send me a Slack. I want to make sure I send you something in terms of being a great participant and supporting me during the session here. And definitely thank you all so much. We are done.
Thank you, Bobby. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.